Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray,
And I'm Chris.
and we talk a lot about the lost colony. In fact, on this podcast alone, we have, by my count, done two previous episodes on the colony at Roanoke, what we call the lost colony. We did a general episode on it, and then most recently, we did an episode where we looked at some of the most recent discoveries related to the lost colony. But when we talk about the lost colony, Chris, I've come up with a question since this idea popped in my mind. What if the real story of Roanoke happened before the lost colony? What if before the colony disappeared, the first colony at Roanoke destroyed itself? And of course, here we're talking about the lesser known 1585 um, uh, settlement of Roanoke Island by Ralph Lane and his men. And Chris, it's a very different story than I think what most people are used to when they think about Roanoke.
And I think that goes to show about history you didn't know but should, because, there's always this story of how the actual story begins. And so you do have to go back to understanding um, Roanoke even coming to the attention of Queen Elizabeth and this desire for there to be constant. Superiority. You have the French and the English, and also don't forget about the Spaniards who are just competing for power because the more land that you have, the more power that you have. And I remember we've talked about Christopher Columbus and other people and the three G's, guns, gold, and God. And you still see those same aspects happening here with England's desire to go and quote, settle this new world, if you will, because it was going to require guns. It was going to be all about money. And also, you do it in not just the name of the queen, but also in the name of religion as well. So you see all of these things begin to take place in this desire to get on a boat and to go overseas. However, everybody that leads, including Lane and eventually Greenville and Rolfe and Smith, all of these guys have their own purposes, their own agendas for settling these areas as well.
Yeah. And this particular settlement, one of the things I wrote in my notes was this wasn't a hopeful settlement. When we think about the 1587 expedition led by John White, and we think about bringing families over, trying to establish a new colony in the New World, that's not what this was. This was a military expedition, which was, as far as I know, an all-male expedition. It was a military expedition. You'd mentioned Queen Elizabeth I. She had interest in what we now call North Carolina because they were, of course, the English were, of course, competing with the Spanish as Spanish ships would come out of the Caribbean filled with treasure from the Caribbean and Central America. So she was looking for a place to use as a military base, sort of a place there where her what they called her sea dogs, her sort of government backed pirates would be able to sort of park their ships, resupply, whatever, and then go back out down toward the Caribbean. So this is a very different type of expedition than what we saw or would later see in 1587. This 1585 expedition has a totally different tone. And Chris, what is, I think, where this thing gets all wrong, steps out on the wrong foot, is when they arrive there at Roanoke Island. When they arrive there, they immediately come in contact with the local native population. And things are initially good, but it doesn't take long for this military occupation, this military expedition to turn into exactly that, a military operation against the local native populations.
Yeah, I mean they kind of, I think when they got there or when they were going there, they just thought it would be, this is who we are. We're going to establish this um government or this place, and it was an expedition. And, I did find it interesting that, looking at these first expeditions as they start moving over there and they establish Fort Raleigh and they basically begin to set up camp, that one of the things that they were planning on doing is they wanted to study the wildlife. They wanted to study the natives. They wanted to I remember John White going there, and he was an artist, and he was hired to draw out the place, to make maps and paint watercolors of the region, and to put all of this in a book. And yet, here's what happens in having these interactions with the natives. That's one thing because they can't speak the same language. They don't understand. The natives are like, "Who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing?" But the other problem that comes into this is that this colony or these colonists, this expedition crew, they didn't plan ahead and they didn't plan for the proper amount of supplies and resources. So you start seeing this need for there being more supplies. And how do you get supplies? Well, it looks like the natives are doing pretty well, so there begins to be hostilities between the natives as well as these colonists. And Ray, that's always, the thing is the English, as they came over, just thought that they could walk into somebody else's home and basically do what they wanted to do. And I think this is why history you didn't know but should, because sometimes history applauds the expedition and applauds well, they're just going to new land, but they failed to remember that they were walking into somebody's home and did not really treat the natives in the proper way.
Yeah, and you're talking about, how they looked at the native population there at Roanoke and they said, well, they're doing good. Maybe they can help us out with food and with things like that. And one of the guys who's sort of the governor of this 1585 expedition is a guy called Ralph Lane. Ralph Lane's a military man. He's not a diplomat. He's not an adventurer. He's not any of that. He's a military guy. And so he starts looking at this, I guess, in a military way and begins to have, I guess you could call some suspicions of the local native population, who he begins to think, are we really, I guess, getting the best deal? Are they going to turn against us? Are we safe here? Type of things, and it's going to sort of all come to a head over a cup. And this is one of those stories in history that I absolutely love. There's this cup, and there's a misunderstanding over this cup. It's a silver cup that the English believe the natives have stolen from them. Now, the natives apparently, my understanding is they may have been um, under the impression that it had been given to them as a gift. But Ralph Lane and his military guys say no, it was stolen. And instead of maybe trying to work through a solution, they immediately take a military reaction. He accuses them of theft. He doesn't really do any real investigation or any attempt to understand what's going on. He immediately starts planning a military raid against them. And so he goes in with his guys and they burn a village, they destroy food supplies. And of course, Chris, that's really the wrong way to handle a situation like this. But you got Ralph Lane, who was a military guy. That's the way he handled misunderstandings like this. He thought that these people had stolen a very expensive cup, so he was determined to make them pay the price for that. And
How
also
many
for his
times
truck.
does a conflict or a war or some other thing begin with misinformation or with assumptions? And due to the braggadocio of an individual, they just assume the very worst and begin to go and seek retribution. And and I think it's interesting because so many things happen here. Just coming across Lane, first of all, is a military leader, but he's not really a good what is it, community establishment person.
Right.
You know, I mean, he's that military guy. Kind of later on in American history, you start looking at the Andrew Jacksons, you know, and the Ulysses S. Grant, great military leaders, but they didn't know how to work a crowd. They didn't know how to appease both sides. They just basically, we're just going to go get it. That's what we got to do. That's what we got to do. And so Lane does that. Well, the other thing is they come in, and I think this is right, if I'm not mistaken, that the original landing point wasn't where they actually landed because they got hooked up in some storms and some other things. And so they kind of wound up in the wrong place. And I think that threw them off. You know, you have the beginnings of this adventure where we were plotting to land here, but the storm blew us off to another place. So you got all of these things going against. And then once again, you are talking or dealing with a native group who does not have the same culture, does not have the same language. How do you really investigate who stole a cup or who got a cup? How do you really prove one way or the other? It's going to lead to divisiveness. And then there's no mediation. I mean, Lane is a military guy. He does not want compromise. He doesn't want anything but unconditional surrender. And if you're not going to surrender, or if you're not going to acknowledge fault, then I'll use my military prowess. And basically, what I'll do is go to war with you. And that is a terrible thing, but that's kind of what happens here.
Yeah, and in that strike, by the way, I didn't mention this, in that military operation that Lane and his men took, they killed the chief of the Roanoke Indians, a guy called Wingina. They chase him into the woods, they grab him and they behead him, and they come out holding his head high. And Chris, you mentioned there, I was thinking when you were talking there about how they hadn't really planned to go to this particular location, and it made me think about Plymouth. You know, we talk about the Pilgrims. It was the exact same thing. You know, they were supposed to go further south, closer to Jamestown, which is in Virginia. But because of a major storm they ran into crossing the Atlantic, it pushed them further north, and that then they had planned to go, and they ended up there at what they called Plymouth Colony. And of course, John White, after um, his 1587 expedition fails with the disappearance of his colony, when he returns, it's weather, it's a storm that prevents him from going south um, to Croatoan to see if that's where his daughter, son-in-law, granddaughter, and colony have gone, as he suspected they did. So it's amazing how many times weather, Chris, plays a role in history and how history turns out.
Yeah, and if you also look at it, we can comparing and contrasting Plymouth and Roanoke Island is that the relationship with the natives in Plymouth was completely different than the relationship between the natives and the colonists in Roanoke. And what that goes to say is, once again, Lane, military. You've got this military where up in the north, religion has a big part of this. It
Mm.
is designed to go and to establish a new place. We started with guns, gold, and glory. Well, here, you know, and God. And so here, Lane is all about using the guns to get his mission accomplished. And if he does it in the name of God, so be it. But whereas up in the north with Plymouth, it was all about going and spreading the good news, spreading the gospel. That was a missional effort in addition to settling a new place where they could practice their religion, just due to some of the other turmoil that was going on in England during the time. So I think that from the beginning, the mission was doomed to fail because Lane, Greenville, others had never really planned on having a relationship with the natives. It was all about going and getting what they wanted. And so when they encountered the natives, instinct was, as a military leader, take out the enemy or take out
Mhm.
the people you don't know. And that's kind of what happened, and that's what led to the conflict and ultimately the loss of the Roanoke colony because of these disagreements. We don't know what happened, as of course with our previous podcast. You know, there's all kinds of rationale we've talked about Croatan and all of that, but at the end of the day, it was doomed to fail because of how they entered into the land.
Yeah. Yeah, and this action by Lane, I mean, apart from being unnecessary, in my opinion, like you said, it destroyed any hope of a successful mission. Because, of course, once they've been attacked, there's additional warfare that takes place on Roanoke. And if you read any about this, it was bloody war. This was nasty warfare that broke out between the Indians there at Roanoke and also the colonists under Ralph Lane, these military guys. Because what do? They fight. That's what they do. And by 1586, they are ready to abandon Roanoke. And they do. They abandon Roanoke. And they are actually sort of, I guess you could say, saved by the arrival of Sir Francis Drake, who is in the area. Of course, he's been down at the Caribbean, going after Spanish ships and things like that. But he comes into Roanoke, and I forgot. I think if memory serves me correct, and I didn't pull it from my notes, but I think he wrote about this, or somebody in his group wrote about how bad the situation was there at Roanoke because it had just gone completely downhill. Um, there was nothing left. The relationship between the local natives and the English, because of what Lane and his men had done, it was nothing left. And Chris, what our listeners may find interesting is when they left Roanoke in 1586, the survivors of Lane's mission, it wasn't too long before Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth are sending another expedition over. It wouldn't be long before they would send another expedition over. And one man who was on both expeditions was John White. John White, as you mentioned earlier, he's on this expedition sort of as an artist, looking at the local fish and the local natives. And if our listeners want to see his work, the work is called A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. And I've got it on my bookshelf behind me. And I always, when I'm talking about Roanoke in class, I will usually try to remember to take it in and let it go around because it's got his artwork in there. Of course, copies of his artwork. But when his colony comes back, when John White comes in 1587, I guess a year or so later, they're stepping into a hornet's nest. I mean, the local native population going in is already suspicious of them.
Well, they despise them because it's easy to see because of their color, because of their complexions, because of who they are. But yes, they despise them because go back to what they did to the tribal chief. I mean, that was those people. It's the same group of people. And so you start to see this is not going to be a successful mission because once again, I hate to say it, but it's history. And if you think about it, Greenville and others lead the way through the injustice of our Native American population. This is just the beginning. You'll go through the Trail of Tears, and we'll talk about all of this other expansion and going west and just eliminating and destroying all of the Native Americans because once again it was this come and get because as they believed that the Lord's will was for them to take this land. However, instead of having relationships, and once again, I compare and contrast Plymouth. There was the first Thanksgiving is recorded in Plymouth between the natives and the colonists being able to sit together and share resources and share handiwork and how to do things. There's that side of it. And then down in Virginia, you don't see any sharing because the colonists come in with this desire to just overtake and overthrow by any means necessary.
Yeah, and the situation there in Plymouth, it went downhill as well, and maybe we can do a podcast on King Philip's War. I don't think we've done a episode on that, have we? Um, because it does go downhill, but what I often observe is as long as that first generation, William Bradford and those people were alive and sort of in charge, and as long as Massasoit, and that's the Wampanoag there at Plymouth, as long as that first generation on both sides was there, things maintained. It wasn't always good. There were challenges, but things maintained. It was when their children took over on both sides that you begin to see you begin to see these problems that develop and ultimately break out into what we call King Philip's War. And Chris, you mentioned land there and how what's going on here at Roanoke and what would eventually happen at Massachusetts, at Plymouth, at Jamestown, and that is this push. The English have this push for land. And one thing that I tell students all the time is it was all about the land. The natives had it, the English or later the Americans wanted it. And that was the core of most of the conflict that happened as the English came in to North America, into Central America, South America, and so on. And as they pushed west, ultimately in the United States to California, it was all about getting that land. And sometimes the land itself, but then other times the resources on that land, like gold, for example.
Yeah, it's just a major land grab. And dare I say, it's 2026. And is it possible that there are still instances of land grab going on? And so you ask the question once again, have we learned how to deal with people who are not like us? Are we still going into areas and grabbing the land by any means necessary? These are lessons that we still face discussion with. And it just goes to show you that history, if you don't study it, if you don't try to change it, then you're doomed to repeat it. And it doesn't necessarily mean you'll repeat it for good. And once again, those who come after Lane experienced terrible, harsh realities, not because of who they were. I mean, these were women and children that came. They were just coming to get away from England to come and start a colony because they've been told about all the beautiful things about it. And so when they get there, all of a sudden they're met by these terrible situations, and it's because of what happened previously. And so they didn't deserve it. The natives didn't deserve it, but because you had this gung-ho military push, we start to see this unraveling of humanity and its relationship with one another.
So, Chris, when we think about the lost colony, 1587, and John White's gone a few years and then comes back and finds them gone. We often think about that in the context of it being a mystery. What happened to them? I remember I heard one historian who studied that very carefully one time say the lost colony was not lost. They knew where they were. We just don't know where they were. Um, but we always think about it in form of mystery, Chris. But what if we think about the lost colony as an ignored warning? What happened in 1585 was a warning. And in 1587, that warning had been ignored. Now, that's not to say, I'm not saying that the local native population killed the Roanoke colonists in 1587, 1588. I don't believe they did. But it's clear that when John White's colony landed in 1587, they were landing in the middle of a situation that had already gone south and had put that colony maybe on the road to failure before it even got started.
Yeah, I think as you started, you were talking about the lost colony was lost from the very beginning. And the reason that it was lost is because of the selfish actions of others long before the opportunity came to establish a colony in the means of promoting a balance of harmony and relationships and just life. And so, yes, the devastation is that these individuals did not have the chance to establish what the goal was. Once again, in Plymouth, a city on a hill that never had the option to be able to be established in Roanoke because it was lost from the get-go because the mission was lost on the people who led it.
Yeah, you've mentioned several times here guns, gold, and God, and they were all present here. You had guns, and that those were the instruments used by Ralph Lane and his men. You have gold in the form of that silver cup that was so valuable to the English, they were willing to fight over it. And then you have God. One of the more disturbing aspects of that initial attack on Wingina and his people there at Roanoke was the signal to attack was a phrase, I think it was Christ our King or something like that. And that was used as the signal to launch that attack, which is, you know, when you think of Jesus and you think of, the Sermon on the Mount and all of that, that's sort of not, the picture you get, using him as a means to launch an attack like that. So, Chris, another great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. We've got some more great episodes to come. If our listeners want to know more about the 1585 expedition of at the Roanoke colony that we've been talking about, they can check out The Head in Edward Nugent's Hand, Roanoke's Forgotten Indians by Michael Leroy Oberg. It was published in 2008 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. I know that is still available, wherever you buy your books, and it's a very good book. I do highly recommend it. Also, as always, Chris, we ask our listeners to share this podcast with their family and friends, whether they're listening to it on YouTube or Spotify or anywhere else they get their podcasts. And Chris, I think it's safe to say we've got some exciting episodes coming up.
Absolutely. It's always just a joy to be able to share with our listeners some of the things about history that needs to be thought about and looked at in a new light because it helps us to make sure that what we're doing is always in the right way of promoting unison and harmony in everything that we say and do. So I appreciate you bringing about this episode. Excuse me. Sorry, I was trying to hold it off. That was that sneeze that was coming. But yeah, this has been a great episode, and I really appreciate our listeners just listening, but also passing it on to others. And I hope that they'll drop a comment or two, tell us what they like. As always, they can find us on pretty much wherever you can find your podcast, whether it's Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, whatever it might be. But the best thing for us is we do this because we want to encourage individuals to uh, be in learn more about history and to become engaged with history, but also to talk about how history is still impacting today. So go out there and find somebody and say, hey, I want to encourage you to check out not just this podcast, but one of the other episodes that we've done, maybe on what happened to the Lost Colony or some of the other things that we do. So we sometimes go all over the place with many different things. And I'm excited that in a few weeks we're going to be talking about kind of something that relates very close to kind of my hometown about the Dismal Swamp and kind of about the things that took place there because that's got a fascinating history. So it's just these little things that we continue to bring on, Ray, that I hope individuals will say, yeah, that interests me.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Chris, we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up. Until next time, I'm Ray,
And I'm Chris.
and we'll talk to you later.